on CityCast Austin, if you're like me, you probably have an opinion about Austin's population growth. But it's time you know the facts. I'm here with Austin demographer Lila Valencia to find out who's been moving in, who's moving out, and who's really driving new growth in Austin. Oh, and after the interview, Eva Ruth will be joining us for a conversation sponsored by Better Way Blood Testing about how they've revolutionized blood work. So stick around to learn more. It's Tuesday, January 7th. I'm Nikki Devon, and this is what Austin's talking about. Hello, I am here today with Lila Valencia, Austin City demographer. Hi, Lila. Thank you for being here with me.
Hi, Nikki. It's a pleasure being here with you.
So, okay, for a while, Austin was the 10th largest city in the country. And as of May, that was not the case. Did we shrink? Because it does not seem like it. As I'm moving through the city, it does not seem like we're losing people. It seems like everybody is everywhere. Do you think we're going to get back into the top 10?
So I don't think we're going to get back into the top 10, not this year. I think, it's possible sometime into the future, but that actually doesn't mean that we're shrinking. It just also is relative to how other places are growing. And the city that passed us this last time, Jacksonville, Florida, was just growing a little bit faster than we were. And so they were able to surpass us. And so I think this next May, when we get the new data, we might actually fall back to 12th or even 13th because the places that are just behind us are growing a little bit faster than we have been since 2020. And so it's not so much that we're shrinking. We're still growing. We're just not growing as fast as other cities are right now.
I love to hear it. I won't lie. I'm excited about us going down a little bit on the list. Now, I saw this and it was really surprising. Is this true? We have not officially broken past 1 million people yet. Is that true?
That number really depends on what number you look at for 2020. The city of Austin challenged the 2020 census count because we really believe, after looking at internal data, that the Census Bureau undercounted us. And we went through the official appeal process. The appeal process was not very fruitful. It's an antiquated model that really even the Census Bureau is looking to update. But according to us, to internal data and analysis that our team did, we do believe that in 2020, we surpassed the 1 million mark. We were at 1,006,800 or so people.
Wow.
But according to the Census Bureau, we were only at 961,000. So really, it depends, what data you're using. But we believe that the data that we're looking at is the most accurate.
So are they overhauling this system? If they're aware that it's antiquated, are they looking to fix it or change it or anything like that?
I think they're looking at other methods of input along the way, but there's a lot that rides on the official decennial count, apportionment, the number of congressional seats that states get, and so there's a lot of information that really rides on those very official numbers. And so what the Census Bureau is trying to do is to find other programs through their estimates programs to try to understand or better capture what may have happened in 2020. But for us, for now, we're stuck with that 2020 figure. But in order to really adequately estimate and anticipate growth, we need to use the most accurate data. And so at times, our figures will look a little bit different than the Census Bureau's figures.
All right, let's back up. I want you to tell us a little bit about what you do as a city demographer and, maybe talk a little bit about Austin's general plan for growth. How do we approach our growth, especially if we're dealing with having these numbers that may or may not be true? So I'm curious how we bake in the cake. What do you do? How do we figure this all out?
Sure. Well, like you said, right, you definitely feel the growth and you're seeing the growth in different ways. And so I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that a lot of folks in Austin are thinking about our population growth. And so as an organization, the City of Austin does a lot of planning to account for that growth, and not just within the planning department where our office sits, but also at city council. They really kind of set the agenda and the vision for how we approach those growth plans. And then the city manager is ultimately responsible for the execution of that vision. My role as the demographer is to really be helpful in providing the most real and most comprehensive data that can guide those decisions at every level of planning.
I'm curious about what I kept hearing is like there are 50 people moving to Austin a day, or we estimate that there are 100 people moving to Austin every day. How do we know that? Like, where is that coming from? Is that just something that people are making up? But, or is that a real thing?
I know sometimes when you get really familiar with the numbers, it does feel like sometimes we're just making these numbers up. But there's a number of ways to look at, how a city's growing. And we really, as demographers, we look at major components of population change. And that's really, population can change in just three ways, right? It's like you can be born into a population, you can die out of a population, and you either move into it or you move out of it. And so sometimes we use simple, addition and subtraction to try to figure out if these many people were born into the population, these many died, the rest is people who moved in or moved out, right? And so that's one way to kind of get at migration. There's also Census Bureau surveys. The American Community Survey asks people where they lived last year when they're responding to a survey. And so we get an estimate. There's actually IRS data also that can capture, changes in people's tax forms that they used to live in. Yeah, and U.S. Postal Service can capture changes in addresses. And so we kind of bring together a lot of these different data sources to really try to understand how people are moving throughout the country, because we don't have an actual official registry. And so we really just kind of have to bring together those different data sources to give our most educated guess about what's happening.
My rational mind is like, yeah, that makes absolute sense. Yeah, these are the ways that you attract this. But hearing it all together, I'm like, that is a lot of information to funnel and like try to make sense of. That's kind of wild. That's a lot. So for a lot of us, COVID changed things dramatically, right? So, I guess what impact did the pandemic have on Austin's population? Do we know?
So we know that there were a lot of people moving into the area looking for housing. And so we saw, prices soar. Quickly after that, though, we didn't see everyone stay. And so a lot of folks that maybe moved here, that maybe were renting, that were considering whether they were going to stay here, that were sort of working through their work from home, their new work from home kind of realities, we're here trying it out. But what we did end up seeing was that growth has really started to slow down relative to the previous decade, the decade before the pandemic. It used to grow about 2% every year. Since 2020, we've grown 2%.
Oh, wow.
And so really our growth rate has declined to about a fraction of that. And so we know that we saw an influx of people, but they didn't all stay in Austin proper.
God, that's fast. I wonder why they didn't stay. I'm so curious. This is amazing. I love this. That is not what I thought you would say. It's so funny because when you're in it, it really does feel like, where did you come from? What are you doing here? So now I'm going to ask the thing that I'm sure plenty of people, it's another one of those things that people have probably lied about and just said at parties. Is everybody coming from California? Now, I don't think so. I feel like I'm meeting people from all over, but I do think that there's this like overall thought that people from California are moving in and making everything terrible. Is that what you're seeing?
I have a lot of compassion for folks from California because, they definitely get
they get a bad rap.
They do. They get the bulk of the blame, and I'm sure there's people sitting in traffic, cursing Californians. But the numbers tell a different story. The biggest share of people who move to the Austin area are coming from other parts of Texas.
Oh.
So they're moving from places like Dallas and Houston and San Antonio. And then when we do look at people who move from other states, Californians are the ones that are moving in greater numbers, but there's also a larger population in California. And so, they definitely have the highest share of other states that are moving into the Austin area. But other Texans have them beat.
Okay, so y'all heard it here. Stop blaming it on California. It's other Texans. Do we have any theories on why people were leaving, or it's just like it just didn't work out and they left? Do you guys even try to think about stuff like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's super challenging, right? Because it's related to, sort of monitoring the movement of people, which we don't, are not very good at doing and measuring that directly. And so we try to understand that. And one of the things that we saw is so last year, not only did Austin, drop out of the top 10, but for the first time in 20 years, we saw that more people moved out of Travis County than into it. And that's been happening in terms of people moving in and then people moving out. But a lot of times we couldn't really see the movement out because we were always getting more people. And so our net migration figure was always in the positive. But this last year, Travis County actually had more people move out. And so, there's a number of reasons why that could be happening, right? And so we know that affordability has been a challenge in Austin for some time. And we know that we see that some families of color in particular have been moving out of the area when there was an influx of people with higher affluence that were competing in that super tight housing market. We saw that, more families of color were moving out. And when we looked at the 2020 census figures, we saw an actual population decline in the number of Black and Latino children. And so we know that they're not moving out alone, right? But they were moving out with their families. And so part of the reason I do think is, related to affordability. Another part that's also, somewhat related to affordability is just that the types of housing stock that may be available in Austin may not be what those families are needing at the price points that they're needing them, right? And so they may be able to find, if they're looking for ownership, they may be able to find more opportunities for home ownership in the suburbs than they are in within the city. Some people wanted to be farther away from people. In fact, Census Bureau data showed that people were moving to exurbs, even farther than suburbs, because now they could work from home and they didn't have to be close to their job to have a commute to go to or go through. And so there's a number of reasons, but those are some of the reasons that we think we saw some folks move out.
What have you learned from looking at the demographics of AISD's enrollment numbers?
Yeah, so, I talked a little bit about how we saw a decline in the number of African American and Latino children in Austin, but the overall child population grew, and in Austin and across the region. And, we have been aging, so we are having, and part of the aging of the population is related to lower fertility rates. So we are having fewer children, but our child population is still growing. We're also seeing some challenges, right? Where, as I mentioned, particularly families of color have been moving out of the city. And so if they're moving out of the city, they're more than likely moving out of the Austin ISD district. And so we can see how those two things might impact enrollment. But I think that school choice has as much to do with some of those declining numbers as affordability and declining fertility rates.
Okay, that's a vast, big issue, like kind of multifaceted. Yeah.
And part of the reason that I say that is because, the African Americans and Hispanics tend to attend public school at higher rates than white and Asian children. Mm-hmm. But white and Asian children are driving growth in Austin. And so really, that school choice, that's where that school choice really comes into play there.
Wow. Oh man, I'll be thinking about this for hours. So just like general demographics. In 2014, I think University of Texas at Austin report found that Austin was the only city among large, fast-growing cities that had a shrinking African American population, like to your case that you just said, and also Latino population. And from what I'm hearing you say, that still seems to be the case, is right? Like as early as last year, you found that more people of color were leaving the city. Is that still on trend, do you think?
So what we saw this decade, when we looked at the numbers between 2010 and 2020, we saw that there was growth in all populations and all race and ethnicity groups. So the African American population grew, Hispanic population grew, we all grew. But when we dug further into the data, it was particularly children who were African American and Latino where we saw an actual decline. Even though the total population grew for those two race ethnicity groups, the child population did not. And so that's where we can then connect the dot that families are leaving. And when we look at some of the changes in sort of household makeup, we see that we have fewer African American households in Austin than we have family households than we had before. The populations grew, except that not all of the population grew, right? You really have to dig into the data to see what age groups this is affecting. And then for the first time ever, really, since Hispanic ethnicity has been recorded, the Hispanic population share dropped. So its total number grew, but it's now a smaller piece of the total population pie in Austin than it used to be. It's about 32.5% compared to about 35% that it was in 2010.
Wow. That makes me curious. How would you describe Austin's diversity, like both economically and racially? Are we measuring up to other cities that are similar to our size?
So one of the things that the way that I like to describe Austin's diversity is I call it Austin's unique diversity, because Austin is absolutely diversifying, right? So there is a larger share of populations of color than there used to be in 2010. But when we start to disaggregate the data a little bit more and look at, comparisons to other cities, look to see what's happening across the country and across the state, we see different patterns. And so, for instance, in general, populations of color drove population growth across the country, across the state of Texas. For instance, 95% of all population growth between 2010 and 2020 that took place in Texas came from populations of color. So
wow.
Less than 5% came from white population.
Wow.
But in Austin, the white population drove population growth.
Right.
And there was only about 4 other cities across the country that experienced the same thing. And these cities were places like Denver, Phoenix, and Raleigh in North Carolina. And so when we start to look at, you brought up the economy, when we start to look at, what's driving the economy in some of those cities, then we start to see some similarities, right? And so we know that the information sector is a very strong sector in those cities as well. And they're also growing through a lot of population growth there too. And so we start to see that there is a little bit of a unique trend that's taking place in Austin, especially when we compare it to what's happening across the country.
As far as the demographics of people moving here, are we seeing more or fewer families? Are we seeing more single people? Because to me, it feels like it's like a single Mecca right now. It feels like everybody is single and young and upwardly mobile and taking over the city, but I'm also old and cranky. Are we seeing just like more families or more single people? Do you guys keep track of stuff like that too?
Yeah, so we definitely look at, different characteristics of movers into the area compared to, the general Austin population. And a couple of things that we know about people who move to Austin is that they're typically younger, right? So the median age in Austin is about 35 years of age. And so people who are moving into the area are in their mid-20s, right?
Wow.
And so it's no surprise that they're less likely to be paired up or married, right? Or in a family status, right? So they're more likely to be single. They're also, even though they're relatively young, they're also more highly educated and tend to have higher median household incomes relative to those already living in Austin. We've also seen a little bit of a different shift. So, for instance, typically, we get about the same shares of men and women moving to Austin. But when we look at the data that specifically looks at people moving from other states, we see that there are more males that are moving from other states into Austin compared to women. When we look at international migration, we see that there are more females compared to men moving to Austin. Yeah,
Wow.
so it really, you really have to kind of parse out the data and really look to see what's beneath the surface. It's all in the details.
Okay, I'm really curious about like how or if at all has Austin's growth impacted the cities around it? Because especially if we're having people coming in from other places in Texas, there's got to also be kind of like a reverse of that, especially since the affordability is such an issue. I know a lot of people are moving to New Braunfels or San Marcos or so how is our growth affecting those around us?
Yeah, our growth is definitely affecting suburban growth. Like the city of Austin has been growing at about, 2% in the last 4 years, but the region as a whole has been growing like about 2% a year, like much faster.
Yeah.
And the reason that is because there's a lot of people moving to places like Georgetown and Leander. And, those places are among the fastest growing cities, not just in Texas, but in the entire country. Some of it is related, to affordability. Some of it is related to just people, still wanting that American dream of the suburban home with the, half acre lot, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's easier to attain that and achieve that in a suburb and sometimes more affordable to do so. And then, there's also people who are moving from other states, like they're saying they're moving to Austin, but sometimes they're in Cedar Park. And to them, well, that's the Austin area, right? That is Austin. And so
Yeah.
absolutely, Austin's draw, Austin's economy is bringing people here, but where they end up is much more likely to be outside of the city of Austin than within it.
And that's got to be, I'm imagining it's kind of difficult to not constantly be, but often be having those conversations with people like, nope, that is Round Rock, that is Cedar Park. It all seems like it's a part of the Austin area because it's such a close drive. I feel that way about Buda and Kyle, but what I'm hearing is that no, like there is definitely an Austin proper that we try to keep our demographics for Austin proper. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's so my role is to keep track of Austin proper's demographics, but it doesn't exist, in a vacuum. It exists within the region. And so it's important to understand, right, what's happening in the region.
Yeah.
And historically, Austin, following the typical suburban model and the typical metro area suburban model, it would grow a little slower than the surrounding suburbs, which would grow very rapidly because they have a smaller base, right? So if you add 100 people to a population of 1,000, already you're seeing, very rapid growth, right?
Yeah.
But if you add those same 100 people to an area of 1 million, it's just a drop in the bucket, right? But more recently, what we're seeing is that not only is Austin growing more slowly, but it's not adding quite the same numbers of population that even surrounding suburbs are. So, for instance, we added about 18,000 people since 2020. Places like Leander have added over 20,000 people during that
What?
same time. Yeah. And so they're growing faster and they're adding more people. And so that's definitely a bit of a shift and definitely makes me watch those demographics a little bit more closely as well.
Of course. I mean, that has to be due to affordability. I mean, it has to be. It has to be like people getting as close to Austin as they can, or as close to Austin as they can afford, or at least that's what it seems like to me. So, okay, it's the new year. What demographic changes are we expecting in 2025?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, when I'm looking at the data, I think one of the things that I'm seeing is that Austin is likely to continue on this sort of slower growth trend, especially as long as our job growth is also a little bit slower right now. As soon as I start to see, some increases in our job growth rate as well,
Yeah.
then I know that we'll see some increased population growth too. And then that's very much related to migration and what we see in who moves here and how many people are moving here, right? A lot of migration is driven by the economy. And so there's also international changes. This last year, we saw a higher share of international migrants moving to the Austin area, which hasn't been typically a large share in the past. Typically places like Dallas and Houston will see greater shares of international migrants. So it was a little surprising to see that. And whenever there's changes in the federal administration, we always see some flux in international migration numbers. And so I think we may see a decrease back to historical shares in international migration, given some of the talk around immigration policies that the new administration is likely to bring. And then, of course, other things that I'll be looking at is just who in our population is growing and contributing to that growth, right? Will we continue to see this decline in African American and Latino children, or is that something that will stabilize as rent prices have been stabilizing in the region?
Right.
And of course, that's related to development too, right? So we've had incredible housing development. If we keep that pace, that could really make a dent into affordability challenges that we've been seeing. And really, that may allow more of those families to be able to stay in the area. And so those are all sorts of things that I'm going to be paying close attention to in the next year.
So along those lines, actually, so English and Spanish are the most common or frequently spoken languages in Austin. What can you tell us about our other commonly spoken languages in the city? Do you guys track that as well?
So we do, in partnership with our colleagues at the Language Access Network. We have a great team that focuses specifically on the different languages that are spoken in Austin, and they often work very closely with school districts because that's where we'll see the real time data really changing.
Right.
The survey data that we look at typically is a little bit more lagged, but what's interesting is that Austin has Spanish as its second most spoken language because it unifies so many Latin American countries, right? But we have a great Asian population, a growing Asian population, and it's not always reflected in the languages because their languages are so varied.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, the largest Asian population is the Asian Indian population, but the third most spoken language in Austin is Chinese. And that's because there's so many different variations of the Indian language that are spoken that it's not enough to move them up together into the third spot. And so it's definitely data that we look at, and it's fascinating data to look at. And we've also been seeing larger shares of African languages in Austin. We have a growing African population, and African immigrant population.
Yeah.
And so it's definitely fascinating to look at. And that's part of what I talk about when I talk about Austin's unique diversity. We continue to see more diversity, especially in our immigrant population, but it's just a little bit different than what we're seeing in other places.
Oh, man, what a cool freaking job you have. Great job. So I already asked you about the year. What do you expect to take place maybe over the next 5 years or the next 10 years? To me, it feels like it's like an open runway for for businesses, which is absolutely going to affect our demographics. But what are you seeing for that future?
Yeah. So one of the things that we've been looking at is, sort of the geographic location of jobs in the region, right? The bulk of the jobs are still within Austin city limits, but that's been changing where we see more dispersion, right? So out into, the extraterritorial jurisdiction, like where Tesla is located, up into Williamson County, where Samsung is located. And so one of the things that we anticipate is that there will be other industries that kind of pop up surrounding those other employment centers centers. And so we're going to continue to see a dispersion of those jobs and the location of those jobs. And so it'll be important to understand, are people located and living close to those jobs, or are they having to make very long commutes? And what do those workflows look like now? Is everybody, commuting into Austin for those jobs, or are we seeing more Austinites commuting out? And so I think we're going to see some of that. We're seeing some indication in the data already that we have fewer or smaller shares of people who both live and work in Austin. And we have greater shares of people who live in Austin but work outside of the city of Austin. And so we definitely think that as any time that someone who has a stake in the local economy is brought up to larger power in the federal government, that will have a direct impact on our economy. And so I do think that even though our job growth has been a little slow recently, I feel like that's not going to be for too long. And a lot of it related to just things like that.
Awesome. So is there anything else related to your job as the city demographer, or just like our population changes in general that we haven't covered that you think we should add?
One of the things that's really important, we talked about those 2020 figures, and we're already going to be in 2025, which means that we're halfway through to the next decennial census count. And really, getting the most accurate count is what helps us to really have a constructive and good conversation that makes us feel confident in those numbers. And so I think for me, what's really important is that we start to set the stage in the quality of the data, in the monitoring of the data that really poises Austin to succeed in getting an accurate count in 2030. So that's sort of where I'm really looking forward to in the next 5 years. Yeah.
Lila, thank you so much for being here. This is just tickled my brain in the best way. I'm fascinated by what you do. I'm fascinated. And I am really appreciative of you taking the time to talk to me about it and let me ask you all these ridiculous questions. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you for your time.
Okay, y'all, don't go anywhere. In just a second, we've got a segment sponsored by Better Way Blood Testing. Our executive producer, Eva Ruth, is chatting with Better Way's founder, Eric Olson.
Hello, I'm Eva Ruth Moravec, and I'm here with Eric Olson. He's the founder of Babson Diagnostics, which is the company behind Better Way Blood Testing. So, Eric, tell me, what is Better Way Blood Testing?
Better Way is blood testing reimagined entirely. It's convenient and affordable fingertip blood collection that you can get at your local pharmacy. So you can order it for yourself. You can order it with your doctor. You go to your local pharmacy and you get a simple fingertip collection and you get your results in 1 or 2 days.
Wow, that sounds convenient. So what is the mission of Better Way?
We started all of this 7 years ago, and we did it on the premise that blood testing is not currently designed for regular people. So whether it's the physical discomfort or the psychological discomfort of the blood in the needles, or just the location and the hours and the service, there's always something that is another reason to put off that blood test that you need. And that's why about 40% of people skip their blood testing. So with a Better Way, we're trying to lower those barriers to make it easier and more convenient and more pleasant to get the blood testing that people need to stay healthy.
What kind of impact have y'all had since you've launched here in Austin?
We launched in Austin earlier this year, but we have been building Better Way since 2017. It took us all those years to develop and validate the technology. We did more than 45 clinical trials, tested close to 1 million blood tests, but now we're available, and it's Austin only. We're at 11 locations. Those include H-E-B pharmacies, People's Pharmacies, and Lake Hills Pharmacy, places that you can get excellent customer service.
Can you tell me about how Better Way is considered disruptive technology?
Well, the underlying technology of Better Way is radically new. There's a hand warmer, there's a fingertip blood collection device, there's a sample preparation device, we have a microsample laboratory. Everything's been reinvented and it's all new technology. The way that you get your blood collected and analyzed is like nothing that you've experienced before. And the result is, before Better Way, you had a choice. You could go to a conventional laboratory and you could get a needle in the arm and you could get your medical grade results, or you could get some sort of rapid test at a more convenient location and get some non-diagnostic results. But with Betterway technology, people are able to get their real routine blood work from their fingertip for the first time in Austin.
So what do you think people get wrong or don't know about blood testing?
Well, for one, people are always surprised to learn how much blood gets thrown away. I've spent my career working in laboratories and on laboratory technology, and the actual machines that test your blood use very, very small amounts of blood to do the actual testing. And about 95% of the average blood sample is never touched by an analyzer, and it just gets thrown away. So people are often surprised at how little it takes to give an accurate laboratory result.
What are people surprised about when they go through the Betterway process?
Well, I think the first thing that takes some getting used to is the idea that you can choose your laboratory. And a lot of people don't realize that. A lot of people think of the laboratory as their doctor's utility, when in fact it's your choice. If you want something that's more convenient, more pleasant, you just ask your doctor for Betterway, the same way that you would ask your doctor to use a new pharmacy.
What are the future plans for Betterway?
Well, Austin's been an incredible place to launch a new technology like this. I think that Austinites are very eager to experience the new technology. So we've already had thousands of Austinites that have been able to experience Betterway, and it's for lots of different reasons. Some are doing Betterway for their annual checkup. Some are optimizing their cholesterol or their vitamin D or their metabolism. We'll be expanding to a lot more locations in Austin and moving to beyond Austin. We've got over 100 doctors now that are prescribing Betterway. And we're working with clinics all across town to expand that and make these options more available to more people. And in 2025, we're also working on our next wave of tests. We currently test the majority of things that you'd get for your annual visit, and we're going to be moving beyond that into some important specialties like some more hormones, some more cardiac tests that our customers like to track regularly.
Okay, well, Eric Olson of Betterway Blood Testing, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Eva Ruth. My pleasure.
And again, please check out betterway.com to learn more. We'll have that link for you in the show notes as well, so you're just a click away. Thanks for listening.
That's all for today here on CityCast Austin. You can find links to the Austin Demographer's website in our show notes. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our Hey Austin newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye, y'all.